We're also very happy today to have a NATO representative. Jamie Shea is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges and has been working with NATO since 1980. You are also, Jamie, a regular lecturer and conference speaker on NATO and European public affairs, on security, political communication, and many other areas. So you are the ideal person to talk to us about emerging threats in terrorism. Jamie.
Francois, thank you very much, although you forgot to mention that in 1999, Elle magazine here in Paris also voted me the sixth sexiest man in the universe, which was one of the more scandalous decisions. Why not number one? Still, thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm delighted that IFTRIP has invited me to speak to you. For me, it was not IFTRIP, but YesTrip, because I'm very pleased to be able to speak to the insurance industry about terrorism. I must confess I usually spend most of my time cursing you for increasing my premiums every year when I'm certified as the slowest driver in Belgium. But there you have it. You can't have everything. I'm not going to speak much on insurance because I don't know much about it. What I think you've invited me to do is to give you a political strategic overview of how I see, how NATO sees the evolving sort of threat of terrorism. I'll try to do that in 15 minutes. I'm a graduate of the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, so this is going to be extremely difficult, and there's a lot to say. I'm also aware that when one speaks on such a vast topic as terrorism, I recall one of my favorite sort of books, which is Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. And when William Pitt, the younger Prime Minister of England, or Britain at the time, read it, he said to Burke that it was a rhapsody in which there was much to be admired, but absolutely nothing to believe in. And I quote this because I'm aware that any sort of evaluation of terrorism is going to have a certain degree of speculation and of subjectivity, but I've been dealing with it for some years, so hopefully it will be of use to you. A Chinese journalist came to interview me on Monday at NATO, and the first question that this representative of Xinjiao news agency put was, is Europe becoming more dangerous? Is terrorism a more dangerous threat to Europe? And I thought about this for a while, and then I gave the answer which I'm going to give to you. Not potentially more dangerous. We haven't had, thank God, anything on the scale of 9/11 since 9/11. But let's face it, the number of attacks in the OECD area is still going up. There are more of them, even if individually they are perhaps less deadly than what we saw in Paris at the time of the Bataclan, in Spain back in 2005, and so on and so forth. And we're dealing with a threat which is now more complex, more diverse, has many profiles. And of course, as we saw the other day at Finsbury Park Mosque in London, jihadist terror can provoke right-wing backlashes as well. Whether that develops more is something that we need to keep an eye on. There are an increasing number of cells around the place, foreign fighters, those who managed to make it out of Raqqa and Mosul, and I don't think personally that will be very many because those diehards are there to die, and the Western and other forces that are there to make sure that they don't return, but some will, so the number of cells will go up. We have also a very well-constituted enabling networks. For example, about 1/4 of all of the UK jihadists that have gone off to Syria and Iraq have been recruited by Al-Maharajun, one single network. Certain preachers like Mohammed Ahmed Musa Jibril is credited on Twitter with having recruited about 1/3 of the European foreign fighters that have also gone out to the caliphate. So we've got enabling networks which both radicalize and which finance, which support, which provide safe houses, cars. The infrastructure of terrorism is now well established, unfortunately, in Europe. I mentioned potentially 2,000 foreign fighters still out there. And then we have the guided lone wolf, who is not really a lone wolf. This is the individual who has been recruited and groomed by ISIL and other networks, even if they leave it to his or her, mainly his time and inclination when to strike, and then increasingly the amateurs. I mean, we've just had in the last couple of days on the Champs-Élysées here in Paris and in Brussels at the Gare Centrale, two, thank God, unsuccessful attacks in which the perpetrators alone were killed, but which show a certain type of spontaneity and a certain amateurism as well. Fortunately, that didn't work, but it does show that there are a large number of people who are able to recruit themselves, inspire themselves, and for whom visibility is more important than efficiency. But we know that even failed attacks, if you remember Richard Reed, the shoe bomber a few years ago, or the Nigerian with a very complicated name that I can't pronounce, who was arrested in Detroit, the Pants bomber, even failed attacks can still produce propaganda, can still shut down, for example, the air traffic control network in the United States for days on end, and still therefore have a psychological impact totally beyond the degree of danger that they potentially represent. So we've got professionals, but increasingly getting mixed up with amateurs, and sometimes in interesting combinations. For example, the attacks in Paris and at the Bataclan, the attacks in Brussels at the airport and the metro were very much a combination of battle-hardened types who had come back from the caliphate, recruiting local amateurs quite successfully, as it turns out. We've got Hollywood-style propaganda. At its height, ISIL was churning out 400 videos every month. Slick Hollywood production. They rehearse executions several times. Different types of day, different camera angles to get it right. That's, of course, gone down now, but they're previous speaker referred to the efficiency on the internet, that will stay. We've got very, very sophisticated web exploitation. The dark net, together with organized crime, I'll say a few words about that later, very, very well encrypted software programs. The web serves for propaganda, for incitation, for encouragement, grooming, recruitment, planning, finance, and increasingly the procurement of weapons and transfer of weapons as well. A very flexible business model, particularly if one looks at ISIL. The caliphate is about to end. They're down in now Mosul to the last 4.5 square kilometers, but they are already relocating, for example, to Mahden in southern Syria, to Al-Tamf, to the Euphrates Valley. We've seen that they have this capacity to continue to carry out large-scale attacks in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq. ISIS is franchised with about 19 different countries, with Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria, with groups in Libya, with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, with a Khorasan organization, which is an increasing threat to NATO troops and an increasing rival to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Indeed, in 2015, ISIS doubled the number of countries from about 15 to 25 where it was able to carry out attacks. It was already referred to that the new business model is the virtual caliphate. It's the use of the web to inspire, to recruit, to keep up a constant level of activity. And therefore, this group will exist, if you like, in virtual space, even if it no longer has the same physical manifestation. That said, the end of the caliphate will be a big advantage because about 20% of all of the foreign fighters who have gone out have been women, about 10 to 12% have been adolescents, and they've not been inspired so much by blood and lust, but more by the notion of building the perfect society, living under Sharia law. The caliphate has been cast rather like the Israelis used to cast the kibbutz back in the 1950s as the place of experimentation where you can build the new society. And clearly that kind of propaganda line with women and adolescents will work less well once the caliphate has come to an end. That said, we have to keep things in perspective. I mean, 80% of all terrorist deaths occur in Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Libya, and Somalia. 80%. 90% of all terrorist deaths occur in countries which are already the subject of conflict and wars. The cost every year of violence in terms of guns, for example, US and other parts of the world, or organized crime, the cost of violence is put at $13.6 trillion by the Global Terrorism Index. Terrorism at $90 billion. In other words, a fraction of virtually 1%. Even if terrorism, at least in terms of violence in general, is only a small part, the impact, and that's why you're all here today and why you're interested in this, is proportionally much greater. For example, I think one of the consequences of terrorism for us is not just mayhem on our streets, but in the areas where most terrorist deaths occur, we also see a blooming humanitarian crisis. For example, 30,000 terrorist deaths in 2015 produced 3 million internally displaced people in Iraq, 5.5 million internally displaced people in Syria. Cholera now affecting 200,000 people in Yemen. And of course, the refugee migrant flow, not only migrants, of course, come from economic sources as well, but still, terrorism has an impact in that kind of humanitarian disaster. Youth unemployment, 25% of children in Arab countries who are receiving absolutely no education whatsoever, and therefore widening the pool of frustration from which future jihadists can be recruited. These conflicts, these wars, fuel terrorism. Terrorism in turn fuels the wars in a kind of kickback nexus and pulls in of course, numbers of young people to go off and fight in these wars, which then also gives terrorists extra access to the resources to produce drones. For example, ISIL has been using very advanced drone and grenade capability in Iraq and Syria. Chemical weapons, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons in The Hague has come up with 20 cases in which ISIL has used mustard gas, phosphorus chemical weapons, missile technologies, and this was referred to earlier, also cyber as well. Now, again, let's keep this in perspective. As I've said, more people die from gun violence in Chicago every year than from terrorism in all of the OECD countries. And President Obama, you recall in some of his sort of farewell interviews, sort of echoed Jimmy Carter. A few years ago, Jimmy Carter said we have an inordinate fear of communism. And Obama sort of said on this line, we have an inordinate fear of terrorism. And something, it's true. I mean, if you look at the statistics, 156 Americans have been killed by terrorism since the years since 9/11. After that, it's too many, of course, but far fewer than the 7,000 Americans who die from traffic accidents every year. So it's true, we could relativize this in the great scheme of things as a minor threat. But again, we know that in terms of our public opinion, in terms of the damage which is inflicted, if psychological, even more than physical, this is an issue which can drive our societies apart. There's the fear factor, referred to already, deepening sectarian community, ethnic divides. There's the increasing number of people on watch lists. I mean, when I got into this game a few years ago in France or in my country, the UK, the intelligence services had about 1,000 people on watch lists. Now in France, it's around 26,000. UK, something in the region of 23, 24,000, getting bigger all the time. Again, more women, more adolescents, far harder to track or to know at any time who is going to be radicalized, and it takes about 30 intelligence operatives working full-time to track one single individual. There's, of course, the constant worry about living under a state of emergency, a big debate here in France, which I follow very carefully, and, of course, the whole issue of security versus freedom in our lives. There's the notion of resilience. For example, in Brussels, a terrorist attack, as I know because I'm a big traveller, shut down the airport for the best part of a month. There was the economic losses. The previous speaker referred to those in Paris. It was only 40% hotel occupancy in Brussels for the year after the terrorist attack. But there was a great sense of the society being more or less paralysed for months and months and months economically in travel. Whereas, of course, if you're in Israel and something similar happens, the thing is cleaned up, the buses are running, the airport's reopened within 24 hours. That is the Israeli dictum when it comes to resilience. Whatever happens, within 24 hours, we're up, back and running. And then, of course, as I said earlier, even failure has its impact. Well, where are we then? Well, let me quote Richard Clarke. Some of you may have read his book. I recommend it. He was the National Security Advisor on Terrorism to George W. Bush. And after 9/11, Bush turned to him and said, Richard, this is going to take a generation. And Richard Clarke turned to Bush and said, Mr. President, this is going to take several generations. And indeed, because frankly, so far, I'll be honest with you, our efforts are uncoordinated, progress is intermittent and inconsistent, and is likely to remain so. First of all, we're too reactive. We need to be looking more where ISIL is going next. And for example, most of the foreign fighters have been recruited from Tunisia, which is a country where we feel we've had relative success with democratization. Algeria, after the death of Bouteflika, for example. The Sinai now as a new area. We need, as much as we are fighting the terrorists in the black holes and the failed states where they already are, need to have a much better geopolitical strategy for ensuring that they don't go and contaminate other areas. I mean, one of the tragedies in West Africa has been Boko Haram has not only been a complete disaster for the Nigerians, but has also infiltrated now into Chad, into Niger, into Cameroon, and so on. So we've got to have a much better containment strategy. Secondly, we're very good, we're getting better at destroying the groups and the individuals, but let's face it, we're not far forward in understanding and destroying the ideology. What makes a terrorist? As my former boss, Javier Solana, as Secretary General of NATO, used to say, people are not born terrorists, they become terrorists. How and why? Are they sort of religious fanatics first and violent people second? Evidence suggests that about 50% of the jihadists in Europe have had a criminal background, even if petty crime has spent time in prison, were radicalized in prison. And therefore, as the French expert Gilles Kepler has said, you know, they tend to sort of be violent first and a religious part comes on later. But understanding that particular sort of intellectual journey and how to stop it is something where, frankly, we haven't made much progress. I know in your business you're dealing with resilience, and how do we sort of promote that? I mean, Manchester clearly showed itself a resilient city after the attack. But if the attack had happened in Birmingham or Wolverhampton, would the response have been the same? How can we sort of brand resilient cities? In fact, in your insurance industry, like you do in cyber, how can you sort of benchmark this with standards of resilience and categories and the ability to sort of develop risk assessment models, which can also then drive insurance premiums and the readiness to cover? We've got to also, with our own people, recognize, as the Israelis have done, that we need better schooling and training, not just on de-radicalization, but how you cope with stressful situations. If we're going to have, as I believe we're going to have, more of these sort of terrorist attacks, even if minor ones, and of course one question that we need to face is, will a string of small terrorist attacks provoke the same sort of, you know, mass anxiety as a big terrorist attack? In other words, you know, if it does a little terrorist attack every week, sort of, you know, disrupt Western societies in like a big 9/11 every 20 years. We need to sort of think of that as well in terms of, you know, the pinprick as opposed to the hammer blow. But, you know, one thing that we saw in France when a terrorist tried to set off a bomb on a Thalys train from Brussels to Paris, train that I take very often. Fortunately, we had some US Marines, remember, on the train, and some people who were willing to have a go. The bravery and the willingness to have a go of some, you know, very good people in Borough Market in London a couple of days ago prevented something that could have been massively worse, even if only. So how do we, you know, without trying to create a population of heroes, but how do we sort of create, with education and resilience, a kind of, you know, population, the resilient individual who, you know, knows first aid, is not going to panic, who's got some sort of sense of what to do, and who can, as we saw with Borough Market, you know, save potentially 30 or 40 lives before the police intervene. So there's no silver bullet in all of this. What do we have to do? Ed, you're not stopping me yet, so let me mention a few things. I mean, clearly for me, the internet is the big thing. We need, how do we take down more harmful material? How do we determine what's free speech in one European country and not in another? For example, here in France, if I write in Le Monde an article claiming that the Nazi death camps never existed, I would be prosecuted. If I do that in Denmark, that's free speech. Nothing is going to happen to me. If I say in one country on the internet that I'm going to destroy a target, nothing happens. If I say I'm going to bomb the target I will be investigated. We're still very far in Europe from having a sort of common reference point of what is free speech and what is jihadist material. A lot has been said, of course, about fact-checking and the responsibility of the IT companies to police themselves. In Germany, fines are now being introduced for IT companies that don't take down propaganda, jihadist material fast enough. The big companies, you know, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Twitters and so on, are beginning to take this seriously. For example, we now know that Facebook is able to take down about 58% within a day of material which is flagged, but YouTube has gone backwards from 61% on the first day to 43%. What is legal? Because one of the Europol up in The Hague is having a lot of success with the IT companies, with the Internet Referral Unit, taking down about 90% of the material, but that's because it's able to provide to the internet companies a legal definition, a police legal definition. Whereas if you don't like something and you phone up Google and say, please take this down, this could be your sort of subjective point of view, and only 30% of individual references are taken down. So how do we work on that? That's a big topic. Of course, the other part of this is how do we develop a positive narrative so that when you go on Google and type in, I want to go to ISIL, get me there quick, you don't go directly to the jihadist websites, which is still far too possible even today, but you are led to websites which give you the alternative view. We're very slow in doing this. I mean, you've probably heard of Jigsaw, a Google program which is now developing this, but we need far more cooperation among, as I say, the internet service providers and governments to develop an alternative narrative. I have to stop. You will look at police. Give me 1 minute, Ed. You will look at police and law enforcement as well. The debate in France is clearly about, you know, house arrests, house searches, tagging, and all of that, control orders. How far do we go without encroaching on our freedoms to restrict the scope of these people to be able to operate? And finally, and this is my last word, I promise you, Ed, we, of course, have got to ramp up our efforts in North Africa and the Middle East to persuade, so this was mentioned, countries to cooperate. The Middle Eastern countries, the Northern African countries don't cooperate virtually at all on these issues, even though they're the most directly affected. We've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq how hard it is to train local forces effectively unless you basically go along with them on the operations. And we're going to have to, at a time when interventions, look at the UK, are not very popular in the wake in of Iraq and Afghanistan, persuade our publics that it's in our own interest, and despite the difficulty, to commit to long-term bases. The French have got bases in Djibouti, Barkhane in the Sahel, long-term military presence, long-term training presence, capacity building presence in the region to keep the locals focused on the fight. Let me just finish with a Churchill quotation, which I think sums it up. There's always a tendency, 10 seconds, there's always a tendency in this world to believe there's a silver bullet, you know, the jihadist propaganda online, or you know, border controls of Schengen, or more intelligence cooperation. Recently, for example, in NATO and the United States, we were hoping that cyber attacks on ISIL would be a silver bullet, you know, that we could sort of disrupt their command and control, you know, take away their money out of their bank accounts through cyber attacks. But you may have seen a recent New York Times article by the well-informed David Sanger that showed that after a year of doing this, the Pentagon have really sort of become very disappointed that ultimately these attacks have not had the impact. So there's no silver bullet. And in 1941, in the Second World War, Paul Toole, the head of the Air Force, he wrote to Churchill and said, Winston, I can win the war for you if you give me 9,000 bombers. And Churchill wrote back saying, you know, dear Sir Charles, I'll do my best to give you 9,000 bombers, but don't kid me. Stop it. This is stupid. You're not going to win the war simply with a bombing campaign. And Churchill said something very profound, and I'd like you to reflect on this. Churchill said a lot of jokes, but he also said profound things. He said, everything is in motion all the time. Everything is in motion all the time. In other words, the person who wins is the person who understands complexity, how things impact on each other, the dynamism of how things evolve, the multi-approach, the comprehensive approach, who's able to, you know, generate all of the various instruments and get them working together. That is the person who really understands what's going on, who ultimately triumphs, and not the people who sort of sell you snake oil in terms of the silver bullet solution. So we're in it for the long haul. but let's also be, as Gramsci said, have the pessimism, the intelligence, but also the optimism of the will. I am stopping. Thank you very much.